The thermometer outside Lars Henriksen's cabin read -42 degrees Fahrenheit on the morning of January 18, 1877. Inside his small structure built within the abandoned Caulfield barn, the temperature held steady at 14 degrees above zero without any fire burning at all. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. Lars Henriksen woke to silence on the morning of January 23, 1876. The silence itself was wrong. His brother Eric always woke first, always had the fire rebuilt and coffee heating by the time Lars opened his eyes. But this morning, the cabin was cold enough that Lars could see his breath hanging in the air, and Eric's bedroll across the single room showed no movement. Lars sat up, already knowing something was terribly wrong. The fire had died completely during the night. The cabin, a standard log structure they had built together the previous summer, held no warmth at all. Lars crossed the frozen dirt floor in his wool socks and touched his brother's shoulder. Eric was 31 years old, strong, healthy, and he was dead. The cold had killed him during the night. Lars would learn later from the doctor in town that Eric's heart had simply stopped when his body temperature dropped too low. There were no warning signs, no struggle, no chance to wake and rebuild the fire. He had gone to sleep and never woken up. The fire had burned down to coals, then ash, then nothing. And in a cabin built using standard methods, with gaps between the logs and a single layer of walls between the interior and the brutal Montana winter, the temperature inside had dropped fast enough to kill a sleeping man. Lars buried his brother 2 days later on a hillside overlooking their claim. The ground was frozen solid. He had to build a fire on the burial spot and keep it burning for 6 hours, just to soften the earth enough to dig. 14 people from the scattered homesteading community attended the service. Pastor Niels Bergstrom, who traveled a circuit covering 200 miles of territory, spoke about God's will and the hardships of frontier life. The other settlers offered condolences and practical help. Several men offered to help Lars work his claim through the rest of winter. Thomas Drummond, a Scottish settler whose land adjoined Lars's property, told him that losing family to the cold was simply part of life in the territories. Lars accepted the help and the condolences with quiet thanks. But standing at his brother's grave, looking at the cabin visible in the valley below, he felt something shift inside him. Eric had not died because of God's will or frontier hardships. Eric had died because their cabin was inadequate. The structure they had built using techniques every homesteader knew, the same methods used across the entire northern territories, had failed to keep a man alive on a cold night. And if Lars stayed in that cabin using those same methods, he would eventually die the same way. The realization was simple and terrible. Standard construction was not sufficient. If he wanted to survive, he needed to build something better. Lars spent the week after Eric's funeral studying their cabin with new eyes. He had built dozens of structures in Norway before immigrating to America in 1873. He understood basic carpentry. He knew how to notch logs, how to chink gaps with moss and mud, how to build a roof that would shed rain and snow. The cabin he and Eric had constructed was solid by frontier standards. The logs were straight, the corners tight, the door fitted reasonably well. Other homesteaders had complimented their work, yet it had failed in the most fundamental way possible. Lars began measuring temperature. He bought a thermometer in town, spending money he could barely afford, and mounted it inside the cabin near the center of the room. He kept the fire burning at a consistent level and recorded the interior temperature every 2 hours throughout the day and night. Then he stepped outside and estimated the exterior temperature based on how quickly water froze, how the horses behaved, how his own exposed skin reacted to the air. The difference was rarely more than 20 to 25 degrees Fahrenheit. When the outside air was -20, The cabin interior hovered near zero, even with a fire burning constantly. When the outside temperature rose to 10 above zero, the cabin warmed to perhaps 30 degrees. The fire made a difference, but not enough. Not nearly enough. He started observing other cabins in the area. Thomas Drummond's place was larger than Lars's, built with thicker logs. It suffered the same problem. Jacob Morrison, an American-born trapper who had lived in Montana Territory for 8 years, had a cabin with a stone fireplace and carefully fitted doors and windows. Morrison burned wood constantly throughout winter and still complained about waking to frozen water buckets. Wilhelm Kohler, a German immigrant who had arrived the same year as Lars, had built his cabin using dovetail notches he claimed were superior to the saddle notches most settlers used. Wilhelm's cabin was no warmer than anyone else's. The pattern was universal. Single-wall log construction with a fire burning inside created a structure that was marginally warmer than the outside air, but never truly warm. The heat generated by burning wood escaped through the logs, through the gaps between logs, through the roof, through the floor, through every surface that separated inside from outside. Men could survive in these cabins, but only by burning enormous quantities of wood and accepting that survival meant being cold for 5 months every year. Lars had accepted this reality before Eric died. Now he could not accept it. He began thinking about the problem differently. The issue was not the quality of construction. Thomas Drummond's cabin was built as well as any structure in the territory. The issue was the fundamental approach. One layer of logs between inside and outside was insufficient. Heat moved through solid wood. Heat moved through gaps. Heat moved through every material that formed a cabin's walls. If one layer failed to hold heat, perhaps the solution was not better construction of that single layer. Perhaps the solution was something else entirely. In late February of 1876, Lars rode out to survey abandoned homesteads in the area. Several families had given up and left the territory over the previous 2 years. Their structures remained, slowly deteriorating, but often still standing. Lars was looking for materials he could salvage, logs he could reuse, anything that might help him build something better than what he currently had. He found the Caulfield place on a cold afternoon with clouds threatening snow. Old man Caulfield had tried ranching 5 years earlier. He had built a large timber frame barn to shelter horses and equipment, invested heavily in livestock, and lasted 2 winters before admitting defeat and returning to Ohio. His house had been a simple dugout that had collapsed. But the barn still stood, a structure roughly 30 feet long and 20 feet wide, with walls built from vertical planks attached to a heavy timber frame. The roof was intact, shingled with split cedar. The door hung crooked on leather hinges but could still be closed. Inside, the dirt floor was level and dry. Lars walked the perimeter slowly, studying the construction. The barn had been built well. The timber frame used mortise and tenon joints, properly fitted. The wall planks were weathered but sound. Gaps between the planks let wind through, making the interior almost as cold as the outside air, but the roof kept precipitation out completely. The space was large enough to shelter animals or store equipment, but far too large to heat as a living space. Heating the entire volume of the barn would require a massive fire burning constantly. The amount of wood needed would be impossible for one man to cut and haul. But as Lars stood in the center of the empty barn, he realized he was thinking about the problem incorrectly. He did not need to heat the entire barn. He needed a small living space that was warm. And standing inside this large structure, protected from wind, sheltered from snow, he understood something that would change everything. The barn itself could serve a purpose without being heated. If he built a small cabin inside the barn walls would break the wind. The barn roof would handle precipitation. And the space between the barn walls and the cabin walls would create something Lars had never considered before: a buffer zone. Air that was trapped between 2 layers of walls would not move. Still, air did not transfer heat the way moving air did. if he built a proper cabin. Inside this barn shell, the barn would protect the cabin from wind and weather, and the dead airspace between the two structures would act as insulation. The cabin would only need to hold heat against the still air in the barn interior, not against the brutal exterior conditions. It was not a new cabin he needed. It was a cabin inside another structure, two walls separated by space instead of one wall fighting the elements alone. Lars began work on the Caulfield barn in early March of 1876. He spent the first week simply clearing the interior and making repairs to the barn structure itself. Several wall planks had worked loose and needed to be reattached. One section of roof had lost shingles during winter storms and required patching. The door needed new hinges, which Lars fashioned from scrap metal he had accumulated. He was not trying to make the barn airtight. That would be impossible with vertical plank construction. But he wanted the barn sound enough to stand for years and tight enough to block the worst of the wind. Once the barn repairs were complete, Lars began designing the interior cabin. He had limited resources. He owned Eric's and his combined savings, which amounted to roughly $80 after selling their original cabin to another settler. He had tools, basic carpentry equipment, an axe, a saw, and adze, and various hand tools. He had access to timber on his own claim and on unclaimed land nearby. He had time. With Eric gone, Lars had no obligations except survival, and no plan except to build something that would keep him alive. He decided on a cabin 12 feet wide and 14 feet long, dimensions that would fit comfortably inside the barn with several feet of space on all sides. The cabin would have a single room, a small iron stove for heating, one window, and one door. The design was simple, but the construction would be meticulous. Lars had learned from studying other cabins that gaps and poor fitting allowed heat to escape. His interior cabin would be built with the same care men usually reserved for fine furniture. He started cutting logs in mid-March. He selected lodgepole pine, trees that grew straight with minimal taper. He wanted logs between 10 and 12 inches in diameter, uniform enough to stack tightly. Each tree required careful evaluation before cutting. Lars spent entire days walking his claim and the surrounding forest, marking trees, planning his cuts. Other settlers who saw him working asked what he was building. Lars explained he was constructing a cabin inside the Caulfield barn. The responses were uniformly skeptical. Thomas Drummond stopped by on a cold morning in late March and watched Lars stripping bark from a fresh-cut log. Thomas was a practical man, 43 years old, with a wife and 2 children. He had homesteaded in Montana Territory for 6 years and considered himself experienced in frontier construction. He looked at the barn, looked at the logs Lars had prepared, and shook his head slowly. Building a cabin inside a barn made no sense. The barn provided shelter already. If Lars wanted to live there, he should simply move into the barn, partition off a corner, and install a stove. Building walls inside existing walls was a waste of logs, a waste of labor, and a waste of time. Lars listened politely and continued working. He did not argue. He simply explained that he believed 2 layers of walls with air between them would hold heat better than 1 layer alone. Thomas considered this briefly, shrugged, and rode away convinced Lars had been affected mentally by his brother's death. Lars raised the first wall of his interior cabin in early April of 1876. He worked alone, using a system of ropes and leverage to position each log. The process was slow but methodical. He had decided against notching the corners in the traditional manner. Instead, he used a technique he had seen in Norway, where logs were stacked vertically at the corners with horizontal logs fitted between them. The vertical corner posts provided structural stability, while the horizontal logs formed the walls. Each log was carefully shaped to fit tightly against the one below it. Thomas Drummond visited again in mid-April with his wife Sarah. They brought bread and smoked meat, a gesture of neighborly concern. Sarah was worried about Lars living alone after losing his brother. Thomas was curious about the construction, despite his skepticism. Lars invited them inside the barn to see his progress. 3 walls of the cabin were complete, standing 7 feet high. The 4th wall was half finished. The interior dimensions were clearly visible now, a small single room that looked tiny compared to the vast barn space surrounding it. Sarah asked the obvious question, why not just make the cabin bigger if he had all this space to work with? Lars explained patiently that a larger space would require more heat. His goal was not maximum living space, but maximum heat retention with minimum fuel consumption. A 12 by 14-foot room was large enough for one person's needs and small enough to heat efficiently. Thomas walked around the partial structure, examining the corner posts and the tight fitting between logs. The craftsmanship was excellent, but the concept still made no sense to him. He pointed out that Lars was essentially building 2 complete structures when one would suffice. Lars tried to explain his reasoning about the air gap and heat retention. He described how wind pulled heat away from cabin walls, how a layer of still air between 2 walls would slow heat loss, how the barn would protect the cabin from weather, while the cabin would protect him from cold. Thomas listened, but remained unconvinced. The theory sounded reasonable in an abstract way, but it required believing that empty space had value. Air was nothing. How could nothing provide insulation? Lars mentioned that Norwegian sometimes built double wall root cellars to keep vegetables from freezing. The principle was the same. Thomas had never heard of such a thing and suspected Lars was inventing traditions to justify his unusual approach. The conversation ended politely, but without resolution. As Thomas and Sarah rode away, Lars heard Sarah tell her husband that grief made people do strange things, and perhaps Lars would come to his senses once winter was distant enough to forget. Lars returned to work. He did not need Thomas to understand. He needed the cabin finished before next winter. The calendar gave him roughly 7 months. The work would take every day of that time. He shaped another log, fitted it carefully into place, and continued building his double envelope system, while his neighbors remained convinced he was wasting effort on a concept that defied common sense and practical experience. By late May of 1876, Lars had completed the walls of his interior cabin and begun work on the roof structure. The walls stood 7.5 feet high, providing adequate headroom with space for a ceiling and roof above. He had chinked every gap between logs using a mixture of clay and dried grass, working the material deep into the joints until no light showed through. The chinked walls were tight enough that when Lars stood inside with the door opening closed by a temporary canvas cover, he could feel the difference in air movement compared to standing in the open barn. Other settlers continued to visit, drawn by curiosity about Lars's unusual project. Wilhelm Kohler came by in early June and spent an hour examining the construction. Wilhelm was a meticulous man who appreciated craftsmanship. He admired the tight joinery and the careful log selection, but he questioned the entire premise. Wilhelm pointed out that Lars had now spent 3 months building a structure that was still inside another building. If he had spent the same 3 months building a standard cabin on open ground, he would already be living in it. Instead, he had a half-finished structure that depended on a barn he did not own and could not move. If the barn burned or collapsed, his cabin would be worthless. Lars acknowledged the risk, but pointed out that the barn was solidly built and unlikely to fail. Wilhelm shook his head and left, convinced Lars had made a fundamental error in judgment. Jacob Morrison visited in mid-June and offered a different criticism. Morrison was concerned about ventilation. A cabin sealed tightly inside another structure might trap smoke or create breathing problems. Lars explained he was installing a proper chimney that would vent through both the cabin roof and the barn roof above it. Morrison remained skeptical that any chimney could draft properly with 2 roofs to penetrate. The criticism that bothered Lars most came from a group of 3 trappers passing through the area in late June. They stopped to water their horses at the creek near the Caulfield property and wandered up to see what Lars was building. The trappers were rough men who had spent years in the mountains and considered themselves experts on wilderness survival. They looked at Lars's cabin inside the barn and laughed openly. One of them said it looked like a doghouse built inside a regular house. Another said, Lars must be afraid of the dark to need walls inside walls. The third suggested Lars might as well build a cabin inside his cabin and really make sure he was protected. The mockery stung because it reflected what most of the community believed. Lars was being excessive, paranoid, and wasteful. He was spending enormous effort on a solution to a problem that did not require such an extreme approach. Better construction techniques, tighter chinking, a larger fire. These were the accepted ways to deal with cold. Building a structure inside another structure was absurd. It violated the basic principle of frontier efficiency. Use the minimum resources necessary to achieve adequate results. Lars's approach used double the logs, double the labor, and double the time to achieve uncertain benefits. Lars began constructing the cabin door in early July of 1876. He had salvaged planks from an abandoned homestead 10 miles away, hauling them back in his wagon over 2 trips. The planks were pine, aged and dry, approximately 2 inches thick and 8 inches wide. He selected 6 planks of equal length and laid them side by side on his work area inside the barn. The door would be 30 inches wide and 72 inches tall, sized to fit the frame he had built into the cabin's front wall. He cut a groove along one edge of each plank and a corresponding tongue along the opposite edge, using a saw and chisel to shape the joints carefully. When fitted together, the tongue and groove planks created a solid door with no gaps between boards. He reinforced the assembly with 2 horizontal crosspieces on the interior face, attaching them with wooden pegs driven through holes he had drilled at precise intervals. The finished door was heavy, weighing perhaps 40 pounds, and rigid enough to support its own weight without warping. The hinges presented a challenge. Lars had no access to a blacksmith and could not afford iron hardware. He fabricated hinges from leather he had tanned himself, cutting thick strips and riveting them to create loops that could support the door's weight. He mounted the leather hinges to both the door and the door frame using wooden pins, driven through multiple layers of leather and into the wood. The system was crude compared to iron hardware, but functional and surprisingly strong. The window required different solutions. Lars had purchased 4 small panes of glass in town, each pane measuring 6 inches by 8 inches. Glass was expensive, and 4 panes cost him nearly $3. But he believed the investment was necessary. He built a window frame designed to hold the 4 panes in a 2x2 arrangement, creating a window opening 12 inches wide and 16 inches tall. He positioned the window on the cabin's south wall, 5 feet above the interior floor, where it would admit maximum light during winter months. He constructed a shutter for the window using the same tongue and groove technique he had used for the door. The shutter was mounted on the interior side of the window opening and could be closed at night or during severe weather to provide additional insulation. When open, the shutter folded back against the interior wall. When closed, it created a solid wooden barrier backed by the glass panes, providing 2 layers of protection against heat loss. The roof structure went up in late July. Lars built a simple, peaked roof with a slope sufficient to shed snow, but not so steep as to require excessive materials. He used poles for rafters, spacing them 18 inches apart and attaching them to a ridge beam at the peak. Over the rafters, he laid split planks, creating a solid roof deck. Over the planks, he spread birch bark in overlapping layers, and over the bark, he applied a mixture of clay and sand that would dry to a hard, waterproof surface. The cabin roof stopped 18 inches below the barn roof above it, creating an airspace that would allow any moisture to escape while still protecting the cabin from direct exposure to the barn's interior conditions. Lars purchased a small cast-iron stove in town during the first week of August 1876. The stove was a simple box design, 14 inches wide, 18 inches deep, and 20 inches tall. It had a flat top suitable for cooking, a front loading door, and a flue opening on the top rear. The merchant who sold it to him called it a shepherd's stove, designed for use in small mountain cabins where space and fuel were limited. Lars paid $8 for the stove and another $1 for 6 feet of stovepipe. Installing the stove required careful planning. Lars positioned it in the northeast corner of his cabin, away from the door and window, but close enough to the center of the room to radiate heat effectively. He built a base for the stove using flat stones he had gathered from the creek, creating a fireproof platform raised 4 inches above the cabin floor. The stone base extended 12 inches beyond the stove on all sides, protecting the wooden floor from any coals or sparks that might escape. The chimney installation was complex because it had to pass through both the cabin roof and the barn roof above. Lars cut a hole through his cabin roof directly above the stove, 6 inches in diameter to accommodate the stovepipe plus clearance. He extended the pipe through the cabin roof, sealed the opening with clay and metal flashing he had fashioned from scrap, and continued the pipe upward. Then he cut a corresponding hole through the barn roof, aligning it carefully with the cabin's chimney below. He extended the stovepipe through the barn roof and capped it with a simple rain cover he had made from sheet metal. The dual-roof chimney created a system that drew well, despite the unusual configuration. When Lars built a small test fire in the stove, the smoke rose through both roof penetrations and vented cleanly into the outside air. The draft was strong enough to keep smoke from backing up into the cabin, even when wind blew across the barn roof. The success of the chimney confirmed what Lars had hoped. The airspace between cabin and barn did not interfere with normal ventilation and heating functions. Wilhelm Kohler visited while Lars was testing the stove and asked why he had chosen such a small heating unit. Wilhelm's own cabin used a fireplace that consumed entire logs. Lars explained that a large fire in a small, well-sealed space would create too much heat and waste fuel. His goal was a fire that burned efficiently and maintained steady temperature rather than producing intense heat that escaped through gaps and poorly fitted walls. Wilhelm remained skeptical that such a small stove could keep anyone warm during a Montana winter, but he admitted the installation was well executed. Lars banked the test fire and let it burn down naturally, watching how long the stove retained heat. The metal radiated warmth for more than an hour after the fire died, exactly the efficiency Lars had hoped to achieve. Lars moved into his completed cabin on September 23, 1876. He had spent 6 months building the structure, working alone except for occasional help from Wilhelm Kohler, who had gradually become interested in the project despite his initial skepticism. The cabin was finished. The door fit snugly in its frame. The window admitted light and could be shuttered securely. The stove was installed and functional. The interior was small but well organized, with a sleeping platform built along one wall, shelves for supplies, and a small table Lars had constructed from leftover planks. The first test came during an early cold snap in mid-October. Temperatures dropped suddenly overnight, falling to 15 degrees Fahrenheit by dawn. Lars woke in his cabin and immediately noticed the difference from his previous living situation. The air inside was cold, but not brutally so. He estimated the interior temperature at perhaps 35 or 40 degrees, despite the fire having burned out during the night. In his old cabin, the interior temperature would have matched the exterior almost exactly once the fire died. He rebuilt the fire in the small stove, using a modest amount of kindling and 3 small pieces of split wood. Within 20 minutes, the cabin interior was noticeably warmer. Within an hour, the temperature had risen to what Lars estimated was 55 or 60 degrees. He had no thermometer inside the cabin yet, so his measurements were based on comfort and observation, but the improvement over standard construction was obvious. He was warm without wearing his heavy coat. The water in his bucket had not frozen overnight. The difference was substantial. Thomas Drummond visited 2 days later and experienced the cabin's warmth firsthand. The exterior temperature that morning was 23 degrees. Lars's fire had been burning for approximately an hour, a small fire that consumed wood slowly. Thomas entered the cabin and immediately remarked on the temperature. It was genuinely warm inside, comfortable enough that Thomas unbuttoned his coat. He looked at the small stove, looked at the modest fire burning inside it, and struggled to reconcile what he was experiencing with what he had expected. Lars showed him the construction details, the tight chinking between logs, the well-fitted door, the shuttered window, the cabin roof above, and the barn roof beyond that. Thomas walked outside and stood in the space between the cabin wall and the barn wall, feeling the air temperature in that gap. It was noticeably warmer than the outside air, but cooler than the cabin interior. The air was still protected from wind by the barn's outer walls. Thomas began to understand what Lars had been trying to explain months earlier. The barn broke the wind. The still air between the walls slowed heat loss. The cabin only had to maintain temperature against the barn's interior conditions, not against the full force of Montana weather. Thomas admitted the system worked better than he had expected, though he qualified his statement by pointing out that October weather was mild compared to January cold. The real test would come during deep winter, when temperatures dropped below zero for days at a time. Lars agreed completely. October proved the concept functioned, but winter would determine whether it functioned well enough to justify the effort invested. Winter arrived gradually in 1876. November brought cold nights and occasional snow, but temperatures remained moderate by Montana standards. Lars burned his small stove daily, using approximately one-third the wood he had burned in his previous cabin to maintain comparable comfort. The cabin stayed warm through November nights, even when exterior temperatures dropped into the single digits. The system worked exactly as Lars had hoped, but the winter remained mild enough that no one considered it a true validation of his approach. December continued the pattern: cold but not brutal, snowy but not catastrophic. Temperatures dropped below zero on several nights, but never stayed there for extended periods. Lars's cabin performed well. Other settlers struggled more than Lars did, but survived without particular hardship. Firewood consumption across the community was high, but manageable. No one froze. No one suffered frostbite. It was a normal frontier winter, difficult but survivable. Wilhelm Kohler visited Lars's cabin multiple times during December, increasingly interested in the thermal performance. Wilhelm had been keeping records of his own firewood consumption and noticed he was burning nearly 3 times as much wood as Lars to keep his larger cabin marginally warm. The mathematics troubled him. Wilhelm's cabin was perhaps twice the size of Lars's, but his fuel consumption was 3 times higher. Something about Lars's system was fundamentally more efficient. Wilhelm began asking technical questions about the air gap thickness, the chinking materials, the roof insulation, and the stove size. Lars shared everything he knew. He explained that the barn walls blocked wind, which was crucial because wind stripped heat away from surfaces far faster than still air did. He described how the air trapped between cabin and barn created an insulating buffer that reduced temperature difference between inside and outside. He noted that his small stove burned fuel slowly but steadily, maintaining consistent temperature rather than creating cycles of intense heat followed by rapid cooling. Wilhelm listened carefully and began sketching ideas for his own modifications. Sarah Drummond commented to her husband in mid-December that Lars's cabin seemed remarkably comfortable during her visits. Thomas agreed but pointed out that the winter had been mild so far. Everyone's cabin was tolerable during a mild winter. The question was, what would happen if the weather turned truly dangerous? Thomas had lived through the winter of 1872, when temperatures stayed below -20 for nearly 2 weeks, and several settlers had died. That was the kind of winter that tested construction and killed people who made mistakes. If Lars's system could handle that kind of sustained cold, it would prove revolutionary. If it failed during extreme conditions, then all the effort invested would be revealed as wasted complexity. The mild December weather postponed any real conclusion. Lars continued burning his efficient fire, staying warm, and waiting for winter to show its true face. Pastor Nils Bergstrom arrived at Lars's cabin on the afternoon of January 7, 1877. The traveling minister made a circuit through the Montana Territory that covered nearly 200 miles, visiting scattered homesteads and conducting services wherever settlers gathered. He rode a sturdy horse and carried supplies for extended travel in winter conditions. Nils was 53 years old, Swedish by birth, and had spent 12 years ministering to frontier communities. He understood weather and could read signs that indicated dangerous conditions approaching. Lars invited him inside and offered coffee and bread. Nils accepted gratefully and immediately remarked on the cabin's warmth. The exterior temperature was near zero, but the interior was comfortable enough that Nils removed his heavy coat after a few minutes. He asked about the construction, and Lars explained the double-wall system. Nils listened with interest and mentioned he had seen similar concepts in Sweden, where some farmers built livestock shelters with double walls filled with straw for insulation. The principle was sound in theory and apparently effective in practice based on what he was experiencing. But Nils had not stopped primarily to discuss construction. He carried a warning. He had come north from settlements near the Yellowstone River and spoken with trappers who had wintered in the high country. They reported unusual conditions, clear skies, bitter cold, and wildlife moving to lower elevations in larger numbers than normal. The trappers believed a major cold front was building in Canada and would push south within the next week or two. When it arrived, temperatures would drop to levels rarely seen even in Montana Territory. The trappers were preparing for -30 or -40-degree weather sustained for potentially a week or more. Lars asked how confident the trappers were in their prediction. Nils said they were very confident and he trusted their judgment. These were men who had survived decades in the mountains by reading weather signs correctly. They were not given to exaggeration or panic. If they said catastrophic cold was coming, it was coming. Nils was traveling to all the homesteads in his circuit to deliver the warning. He wanted families to prepare, gather extra firewood, check their chimneys, repair any gaps in their cabins, and prepare mentally for what might be the worst cold snap in 20 years. Lars thanked him for the warning and asked if there was anything specific he should do beyond his normal preparations. Nils looked around the small cabin and said honestly that Lars appeared better prepared than most settlers. His cabin was tight, his stove functional, and his firewood supply stacked neatly outside the barn. But Nils added that no one could fully prepare for -40-degree weather. At those temperatures, things broke that normally did not break. Metal became brittle. Wood split. Fires that normally drew well sometimes failed. Even well-built structures could fail under extreme stress. Lars should prepare for the worst and pray for the best. Nils finished his coffee, put his coat back on, and rode toward the Drummond place to deliver the same warning. The cold front arrived on January 14, 1877. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 6 hours. By sunset that evening, it was -15 degrees Fahrenheit. By midnight, -25. By dawn on January 15th, the thermometer Thomas Drummond kept outside his cabin registered -37 degrees. The air was so cold, it hurt to breathe. Water thrown into the air froze before hitting the ground. Wood made cracking sounds as moisture inside it froze and expanded. Horses stood in their shelters with ice forming on their nostrils despite the hay and body heat around them. Lars woke on the morning of January 15th and immediately checked his cabin's interior. He had let the fire burn down overnight, but not go out completely. The small amount of coals remaining had kept the stove barely warm. The cabin interior was cold, but not frozen. His breath was visible, but not thick. He estimated the temperature inside at perhaps 10 or 15 degrees above zero. Outside, through the small window, he could see frost patterns that indicated brutally cold air. He rebuilt the fire carefully, using kindling and small pieces of wood to coax the coals back to flames. Within 30 minutes, the stove was burning steadily. Within an hour, the cabin had warmed to approximately 40 degrees. Lars added more wood and waited. By mid-morning, the interior temperature had reached what felt like 55 or 60 degrees. He was comfortable in a wool shirt without his heavy coat. The difference between interior and exterior temperature was approaching 70 degrees. His small stove was burning perhaps one log every 2 hours, a modest fuel consumption rate that he could sustain for weeks if necessary. Outside the barn, the conditions were lethal. The temperature remained below -30 for 3 consecutive days. On January 17th, it dropped to -42 degrees, the coldest temperature anyone in the community could remember experiencing. At that temperature, exposed skin froze in minutes. Breathing the air directly caused pain in the lungs. Metal tools left outside became so brittle they could shatter if struck. The cold was a physical presence, aggressive and dangerous, seeking any weakness in shelter or preparation. Lars ventured outside only when absolutely necessary. He had stored firewood inside the barn, stacked along one wall, where it remained accessible without exposing himself to the full exterior conditions. He fed his horse inside the barn, where the animal had some protection from the worst cold. He checked the barn structure daily, looking for any damage or failure. The old building held solid. The gaps between wall planks admitted some cold air, but the barn's interior remained perhaps 20 degrees warmer than the outside. And inside his cabin, protected by the barn and by his carefully constructed walls, Lars stayed warm. Not just alive, but genuinely comfortable. The fire burned steadily. The temperature held stable. His water bucket did not freeze. He could work at his small table without gloves. The system he had spent 6 months building was performing exactly as he had hoped, and outside, the worst cold in 20 years could not reach him. Thomas Drummond ran out of firewood on January 18, 1877. He had prepared what he thought was adequate supply, a woodpile containing approximately 3 cords stacked behind his cabin. In a normal winter, 3 cords would have lasted through January and well into February. But the sustained cold of the 1877 freeze consumed wood at a rate Thomas had not anticipated. His cabin required constant fire to maintain barely tolerable interior temperatures. The single-wall log construction allowed heat to escape almost as fast as he could generate it. By the evening of January 18th, Thomas was burning the last of his firewood. The temperature outside remained -35 degrees. He could not cut more wood in those conditions. Even if he could reach the forest, the cold made extended outdoor work impossible. He faced a choice: let the fire go out and risk freezing, or burn something else. He chose to burn something else. He started with a chair, then a small table, then boards from a shelf he had built along one wall. The furniture burned quickly, and it was insufficient. His cabin remained brutally cold. Wilhelm Kohler faced similar crisis on the same day. His larger cabin required even more wood than Thomas's, and Wilhelm had underestimated the fuel requirements for sustained extreme cold. He had run through his firewood supply by midday on January 18th, and began burning everything combustible he could spare: furniture, tools, handles, split planks from his supply storage. His wife and 2 children huddled near the fireplace, wrapped in every blanket they owned, still shivering despite the fire. The cold was winning. Wilhelm knew if the weather did not break soon, they would face serious danger. Jacob Morrison's situation was worst of all. He lived alone in a cabin even smaller than Lars's, but built with standard construction and chronic drafts. Morrison had prepared poorly, assuming the winter would be manageable. By January 19th, he had no firewood left and limited furniture to burn. He made the decision to abandon his cabin and ride to Thomas Drummond's place to ask for shelter. The ride was only 3 miles, but dangerous in the extreme cold. Morrison wrapped himself in everything he owned and made the journey slowly, arriving at Thomas's cabin with frostbite on 3 fingers. Thomas took him in because frontier ethics demanded helping neighbors in crisis. But now Thomas had 2 men to keep alive with furniture as fuel and exterior temperatures that refused to rise. Sarah Drummond melted snow for water and rationed their food, knowing the crisis might last days longer. The children were frightened. Thomas himself was beginning to question whether his family would survive. He had lived through hard winters before, but this was different. This was cold that exceeded the capacity of standard frontier construction to resist. His cabin, built using the same methods every settler used, was failing. The fire burned constantly. The wood and furniture disappeared into flames. And still the interior temperature stayed below freezing unless they stood directly beside the fort. Thomas thought about Lars's cabin inside the barn and wondered if his neighbor was facing the same crisis. He did not know. He could not check. Going outside except in absolute emergency meant risking death. All he could do was burn what he had and hope the temperature broke before his shelter failed completely. Lars monitored his firewood consumption carefully during the coldest days of January 1877. He kept a small fire burning continuously in his stove, adding 1 split log approximately every 2 hours. The fire burned slowly and efficiently, generating steady heat rather than intense bursts. The small stove radiated warmth throughout the cabin's compact interior, and the heat was retained by the tight construction and the insulating buffer created by the barn walls surrounding his cabin. On the morning of January 20th, with the exterior temperature at -38 degrees, Lars conducted a careful assessment of his situation. His firewood supply remained substantial. At his current consumption rate, he had enough wood to last another 6 weeks without rationing. His food supplies were adequate. His horse was sheltered in the barn and had hay and water. He himself was comfortable. The cabin interior was warm enough that he wore only a single layer of wool clothing. His hands did not require gloves while working at his table. His water bucket remained liquid. He could cook on the stovetop without difficulty. The system was working not marginally but completely. He knew his neighbors were struggling. He had seen smoke from their chimneys during brief moments outside, thick smoke that indicated fires burning intensely. He understood what that meant. They were burning wood as fast as they could cut it, or faster, consuming their supplies to fight cold that penetrated their single-wall cabins without mercy. Lars felt no satisfaction in their difficulty, only concern and a quiet confirmation that his approach had been necessary. The temperature differential was remarkable. Lars estimated the barn interior was approximately 20 degrees warmer than the exterior air. The still air trapped inside the barn structure, protected from wind, did not carry heat away the way moving air did. His cabin interior was another 40 degrees warmer than the barn interior, bringing the total difference between outside and inside to roughly 60 degrees. A modest fire in a small stove created that 60-degree improvement because the heat was not fighting wind, was not escaping through gaps, was not radiating through a single layer of logs into brutally cold air. On January 21st, Lars heard sounds outside his barn during mid-morning. He looked through his window and saw Wilhelm Kohler approaching on horseback with his 2 children bundled in front of and behind him. Lars opened his cabin door, then opened the barn door to admit them. Wilhelm's face showed exhaustion and desperation. He explained quickly that his cabin had become unlivable. He had burned everything he could spare and still could not maintain adequate temperature. His wife was staying with Sarah Drummond. He needed shelter for himself and the children until the cold broke. Lars invited them in without hesitation. The cabin was small, but could accommodate 3 additional people temporarily. Wilhelm entered Lars's cabin and stopped just inside, the door overwhelmed by the warmth. His children, cold and frightened minutes before, began removing their outer layers. Wilhelm looked at Lars with an expression combining gratitude, amazement, and something like disbelief. This was not possible, but it was happening. They were warm. The temperature finally rose above zero on January 23, 1877. The cold front that had held the territory in its grip for 9 days began moving south and east, replaced by marginally warmer air flowing down from the Pacific. By afternoon on January 23rd, the temperature had climbed to 12 degrees above zero. By the following morning, it reached 23 degrees. The crisis was ending. Settlers who had survived the worst cold in 20 years began assessing damage and checking on neighbors. Thomas Drummond rode to Lars's cabin on the morning of January 24th. He found Wilhelm Kohler and his children there, preparing to return to their own cabin now that temperatures had moderated enough to make travel safe. Thomas looked exhausted. He had burned most of his furniture, part of his interior wall paneling, and tools he could not replace easily. His family had survived, but barely. Jacob Morrison had frostbite injuries that would likely cost him parts of 3 fingers. Sarah and the children had been terrified throughout the ordeal. Thomas asked to see Lars's cabin interior. Lars showed him everything. The tight log construction, the chinking that left no gaps, the small, efficient stove, the window with its insulated shutter. Thomas examined each element carefully, then asked the question that mattered most. How much firewood had Lars burned during the 9-day freeze? Lars estimated approximately 18 logs, split pieces averaging 12 inches in diameter and 16 inches long. Thomas had burned more than that in a single day, trying to keep his family from freezing. The efficiency difference was not marginal. It was overwhelming. Thomas walked outside and stood between Lars's cabin wall and the barn wall, experiencing the temperature difference firsthand. The air in that gap was noticeably warmer than the open air beyond the barn. He could feel the absence of wind, the stillness that characterized dead air spaces. He placed his hand on the outer wall of Lars's cabin and felt warmth radiating through the logs. Then he walked outside the barn and placed his hand on the barn's exterior wall. It was cold, but not as cold as the surrounding air. The barn itself was warmer than the environment because the structure contained Lars's cabin, and the cabin's heat warmed the barn interior, which in turn reduced the temperature difference the cabin had to resist. Thomas understood suddenly and completely what Lars had built. It was not just a cabin inside a barn. It was a thermal system, where each component served a specific purpose. The barn blocked wind and precipitation. The air gap provided insulation through stillness. The cabin walls retained heat generated by a small fire. The small fire burned efficiently because it was not fighting impossible odds. The entire system worked together, each element enabling the others. Thomas had lived 44 years on the frontier and considered himself experienced in survival. But he had never considered that the fundamental approach to cabin building might be wrong. He had assumed better construction meant tighter notching, better chinking, thicker logs. Lars had proven that better construction meant rethinking the entire structure from first principles. Wilhelm Kohler returned to his own cabin on January 25, 1877, and spent 2 days assessing the damage and making basic repairs. His firewood supply was completely exhausted. His interior furniture was largely destroyed. His family had survived, but the experience had shaken him profoundly. He had believed his cabin was adequately built. He had used good logs, careful joinery, and techniques learned from experienced settlers. Yet his structure had nearly failed to protect his family during extreme cold. The failure was not dramatic, but arithmetic. His cabin required more fuel than he could provide to maintain survivable temperatures. On January 28th, Wilhelm rode back to Lars's cabin and asked a specific question. Could Lars's thermal buffer system be adapted to an existing cabin? Wilhelm owned his cabin and the land it stood on. He could not abandon his claim and start over. But he owned something else. A deteriorating barn on the back portion of his property, a structure left by the previous homesteader. The barn was in poor condition, roof partially collapsed, walls weathered and loose. But the timber frame was intact. Wilhelm wanted to know if he could repair that barn and build a new cabin inside it using Lars's approach. Lars considered the question carefully. The principle would work, but the execution would be challenging. Wilhelm's barn was larger than the Caulfield barn Lars had used. Repairing it would require significant effort. Building a new cabin inside would mean Wilhelm and his family would need temporary shelter during construction. The logistics were complex. But the fundamental concept was sound. A repaired barn shell with a properly built cabin inside would provide the same thermal advantages Lars was experiencing. Wilhelm explained he was willing to invest the time and materials because the alternative was facing another winter in a cabin that could not protect his family. He had learned during the January freeze that standard construction was inadequate. He could not afford to learn that lesson again. Lars agreed to help him plan the project and offered to share specific construction details. They spent the afternoon sketching plans and discussing materials. Wilhelm would need logs for the interior cabin, clay for chinking, a stove, and metal for roofing. He would need to repair the barn roof first, then build the cabin during summer and fall to be ready before the next winter. The conversation marked a turning point. Wilhelm was the first settler to explicitly adopt Lars's approach after witnessing its performance during crisis. He understood now that the mockery and skepticism had been wrong. The double wall system was not excessive engineering. It was appropriate engineering for conditions that exceeded normal construction capacity. Wilhelm left that afternoon with detailed notes and a commitment to begin work as soon as spring weather allowed. Lars watched him ride away and felt something shift. His innovation was no longer just his own survival solution. It was becoming a technique that others could use. The knowledge was spreading not through persuasion, but through demonstration. The January freeze had proven what words could not. Sometimes the only way to convince people was to survive what killed others. Wilhelm Kohler began repairing his barn in April of 1877. He worked methodically, replacing damaged roof sections, reinforcing the timber frame, and tightening wall planks. Lars visited regularly to offer advice and occasional labor. The project consumed Wilhelm's spring and summer, but by September he had a sound barn structure and had begun building the interior cabin. He copied Lars's techniques: careful log selection, tight fitting, clay and horsehair chinking, reinforced door construction, and efficient stove placement. Wilhelm's cabin was slightly larger than Lars's, sized to accommodate his family of 4, but the principles remained identical. Wilhelm moved his family into the completed structure in early October 1877. The first cold nights proved the system's effectiveness. His wife remarked that their new cabin stayed warmer with less fire than their old cabin had with twice the wood burning. Wilhelm tracked his firewood consumption carefully and confirmed he was using approximately 1/3 the fuel he had burned in his previous cabin to maintain superior comfort. The investment in double-wall construction had paid off within the first month of occupation. Thomas Drummond watched Wilhelm's project with increasing interest. Thomas was a cautious man who did not adopt new methods quickly, but the 1877 freeze had convinced him that standard construction was inadequate for Montana winters. In spring of 1878, Thomas approached Lars with questions about building a new cabin using the thermal buffer approach. Thomas owned no existing barn to retrofit, so he would need to build both structures from scratch. Lars explained that building both a barn shell and an interior cabin required roughly twice the labor of building a standard cabin, but the fuel savings and comfort improvements justified the investment. Thomas spent summer and fall of 1878 constructing his version of the system. He built a simple pole barn, first using vertical posts and horizontal planks to create a wind-breaking shell. Inside the barn, he built a cabin using techniques he had learned from observing Lars's and Wilhelm's work. His construction was competent but not as refined as Lars's original. The gaps between his cabin logs were slightly larger, his chinking less thorough. But the basic system still worked. When Thomas moved into his new cabin in November 1878, he experienced the same dramatic improvement in heating efficiency that Lars and Wilhelm had achieved. By 1879, 2 additional families in the territory had adopted variations of the thermal buffer technique. Jacob Morrison, recovered from his frostbite injuries, built a small cabin inside a shed he constructed specifically for that purpose. A family named Patterson, who homesteaded 15 miles north of Lars's claim, built a double-wall cabin after hearing about the method from Pastor Niels Bergstrom. The technique was spreading organically through the scattered homesteading community, carried by word of mouth and validated by those who experienced the benefits firsthand. Lars had not promoted his innovation beyond sharing information with anyone who asked, but the practical advantages were compelling enough that others adopted the approach without persuasion. Lars Henriksen lived in his cabin inside the Caulfield barn for 6 years. He survived winters that would have killed him in standard construction, using a fraction of the firewood other settlers consumed and maintaining comfort that was unprecedented for frontier living conditions. He continued trapping during those years, working his claim and gradually saving money. In 1883, he sold his property to a family arriving from Minnesota and moved to Oregon Territory, where he purchased land and started ranching. He married in 1884, started a family, and lived quietly until his death in 1902 at age 57. The cabin Lars built remained occupied for more than 30 years. The family who purchased his property lived in it through 1895. After they moved to a larger house, the cabin served as storage and occasional shelter for ranch workers. The barn eventually deteriorated and collapsed during a storm in 1912, but the cabin inside remained structurally sound. When the barn wreckage was cleared away, the cabin stood alone, still weatherproof and solid after 36 years. It was finally dismantled in 1918 when the property changed ownership again and the new owner wanted the land cleared. The thermal buffer technique Lars pioneered saved lives across the Northern Territories during the late 1800s. Exact numbers are impossible to determine because survival often goes unrecorded, but historical accounts reference multiple instances of families surviving extreme cold in double-wall structures when neighbors in standard cabins suffered frostbite, fuel exhaustion, or death. The winter of 1888 brought cold comparable to the 1877 freeze. Families living in thermal buffer cabins survived with manageable difficulty, while those in standard construction faced crisis. The method worked not because it was complex, but because it addressed the fundamental problem. Single-wall construction could not retain heat against sustained extreme cold. Modern historians studying frontier survival techniques occasionally encounter references to cabins built inside barns or double-wall construction methods used in Montana, Wyoming, and Dakota territories during the 1870s and 80s. The documentation is sparse because frontier builders rarely wrote detailed accounts of their techniques, but the physical evidence existed for decades. Abandoned homesteads sometimes showed remains of structures that incorporated double-wall design, though most observers assume the configurations resulted from additions or modifications rather than intentional original design. The knowledge that Lars Henriksen had developed a revolutionary thermal system and shared it freely with his community, was largely lost because no one recorded it formally. The story illustrates how frontier innovation worked. Practical men facing deadly problems developed solutions using available materials and shared knowledge. Good ideas spread through demonstration and word of mouth rather than publication or formal teaching. Techniques that saved lives became standard practice without anyone claiming credit or seeking recognition. Lars never promoted himself as an inventor. He simply built something that worked and helped others do the same. His legacy was not fame, but the quiet fact that dozens of people stayed warm in cabins that would not have existed without his example, surviving winters that might otherwise have killed them in the harsh and unforgiving conditions of the American frontier.